Thank you, William, for your kind presentation. I'd like to thank likewise Elena for this opportunity to come back to the UK. I was in Leicester in March 2020 when the pandemic broke out. I was doing a research stay there with my good colleague, José Cristóbal Carvajal. But unfortunately, I had to interrupt abruptly the stay and go back to Spain. So this is my first opportunity to come back to the UK. So it's a great pleasure to be here today in this amazing conference. Okay, well, I don't have a paper to read, so I'm relying on my very limited spoken English. So let's see what happens. Well, my talk today involves two main issues. First, I'll be talking a little bit about the great leap forward of the Christian expansion of the 13th century. And then I'll focus on the reception of this medieval past in modern Spain. Well, this first picture is a picture of my city, Seville. This is the city where I was born. The city where I earned my PhD, where I've been living over the last 40 years of my life. So this is the monument of King Ferdinand III, right in front, which is placed right in front of the city hall of Seville. So it's a very iconic place of the city and a very iconic monument. And I'd like to draw your attention because I'll be dealing with it later on. Okay, my starting point is the Almohad period. The Almohads came to Iberia around 1146, 47, and they reached the peak of their power around 1195 with the great victory of Alarcos, which was obviously a crushing defeat of the Christians at that moment. But only 17 years later, here, the Almohads suffered a crushing defeat in front of the Christian coalition here in 1212 in Las Navas de Tolosa. It's the battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, Al-Aqab in Arabic, and that victory opened the Guadalquivir Valley to King Ferdinand III. So the 13th century is really a tipping point in the history of medieval Iberia. Is the moment when the Christians not only redressed the imbalance, but they tipped the balance of power in Iberia in front of the Muslims. So as we can clearly see in the map, the Christians took over many territories across Iberia over the 13th century, starting from what is today Extremadura, the kings of Leon, the kings of Portugal in what is today southern Portugal, the kings of Aragon, of course, in the easternmost part of Iberia, including Valencia and first the Balearic Islands. And then obviously, as I said, King Ferdinand III accomplished a great success, taking in a row the cities of Cordoba in 1236, then Jaén in 1242, and then especially Seville, which was back then the most important Iberian city. Then his son and successor, King Alfonso the Wise, Alfonso X, took Niebla in 1262, which is obviously a smaller town, but it was the capital city of that territory, the territory of Huelva, precisely, back then. And then also the city of Jerez in 1267. These two were the most important achievements of King Alfonso in front of the Christians. And then finally, his son and successor, Sancho IV, he took Tarifa in 1292, thus reaching the southernmost tip of Iberia, which is the Strait of Gibraltar, an extremely strategic territory, because obviously all Muslim powers always came to Iberia from northern Africa. So controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, the ports of the Strait of Gibraltar, that means basically Tarifa, Gibraltar itself, and Algeciras was a major concern for the kings of Castile. And yes, of course, Alfonso likewise took Murcia in 1262 with the help of King James I of Aragon, in the context of the so-called Mudéjar revolt, which is actually the earliest war between Castile and the Nasrid Emirate of Granada, which involved the participation of the Muslims from the Guadalquivir Valley and Murcia. All right, so obviously between, let's say, here 1217, when the Portuguese took Alcázar do Sal, Qasr ibn Abidanis, and 1292, which is the taking of Tarifa, in this 75 years time lapse, the Christians achieved a huge success in front of the Muslims. So in this map, we maybe we can see perhaps a better picture of the landmass that the Christians took over during this process. So it's clearly the great, as I said, the great leap forward of the Christians in their medieval expansion. So that the Muslims became much more limited in their territorial presence in Iberia, because they only got left the lands of the Nasrid Emirate. And well, in this figure, I've tried to present a more specific detail of this expansion. So in this, as I said, over these 75 years time lapse, the Christians took over nearly 150,000 square kilometers, which is roughly 1/3 of the whole Iberian territory. If we want to compare, for example, that this is nearly half Italy, is a little bit more than what is today Greece, and is nearly double than is today Ireland. So I'm focusing now on how this expansion process has been received in modern Spain and in modern scholarship. And here, of course, we need to deal with the notion of Reconquista, which I'm using in Spanish because I think it's a well-known Spanish concept, which is usually used in Spanish in other foreign languages too. So ever since the 19th century, the Reconquista very much became the hallmark of Spanish scholarship about the medieval period. And it became likewise a form of public memory in Spain. On the slide, I'm presenting here this monument of King James I of Aragon, who took over Valencia in 1238, and then over the Balearic Islands. So in this monument, he is described very much as the liberator of the city. On the day of Saint Denis, October 9th, 1238, he entered Valencia victoriously and set it free from the Muslim yoke. This is the inscription on one of the sides of the monument. Now, obviously here, I think the idea of liberation and the idea of Muslim yoke are the two sides of the same coin, the coin of the Reconquista. So in this regard, I think this notion involves very much a one-sided view, rather biased approach to medieval Iberian history, because it's drawing basically, this notion draws basically on the Catholic narrative, as we can see here in this monument. So the idea of King James as the liberator very much corresponds to this, the narrative of the victors in this case, which is the narrative of the Catholic monarchy, in this case of Aragon. So the influence of this approach, of this, what we may call this Reconquista approach, has been really pervasive in Spain, not only in Spanish scholarship, but from a more general perspective. So I'm presenting now some instances of how the Reconquista has been played out as a form of public memory in modern Spain, in present day Spain. And I'm starting with the case of the community of Valencia, precisely, in which they celebrate October 9th, ever since the beginning of the democratic period. As you all probably know, Spain is structured in the so-called comunidades autónomas, autonomous communities. So the community of Valencia every year celebrates his, I wouldn't say national day, perhaps, but its local day, the day of the community of Valencia, is October 9th, which is the date of the taking of the city of Valencia by King James I. So this celebration obviously involves the participation of public officials. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit closer to here? I'm gonna raise the volume here. So you have a message from Zoom saying that the volume is a little bit down.
All right.
It's understandable, but
okay, thank you. So this celebration, as I was saying, involves the participation of public officials, and it includes, as we can see here, a public ceremony, a wreath-laying tribute to the King James I. This is actually the monument that I was mentioning before. So in this regard, we may say that this notion of Reconquista has a public and institutional role in present day democratic Spain. So it's not only something from the past, from the 19th century, but it continues to be influential nowadays in Spain. Well, and I'd like to draw your attention also to another point here, because traditionally, Reconquista has been a very cross-cutting concept. Initially, in the 19th century, it was shared by both conservatives and liberals. And this is, I think, one of the main bases of the great success of this notion. Over the 20th century, obviously, Franco made an intense political use of the notion of Reconquista, and that maybe turned the notion of Reconquista something more close to the conservative values. But still, as we may say here in this slide, it continues to be a reference not only for conservative groups. In this case, still in Valencia, the local government had to pull back an advertising campaign in which the Muslims were compared to COVID, saying that, well, the COVID was as powerful an enemy as that of King James had to fight over the medieval period. So obviously there was some kind of public outcry against this institutional campaign, and the local government of Valencia had to pull back the campaign. So the thing is that currently Valencia is ruled by the left, not by the right. Okay, so it's not something exclusively from the right. It continues to be, to a certain extent, a shared concept between different groups. Okay, now I'm turning to the Balearic Islands, which were likewise taken by King James I ever since 1229, with the taking of the city of Palma, Madinat Majorca. And in the island of Majorca, we likewise find a public ceremony, in this case, in a more local level. This is not something general from the whole community, the whole autonomous community of the Balearic Islands. But we find something very similar as in Valencia, the celebration called Festa del Estendard, which is the celebration or the feast or the Day of the Banner, which commemorates precisely the taking of the city of Palma by King James I in December 1229. So that celebration likewise includes a wreath-laying tribute in the monument of King James I in the city of Majorca. Well, I think this is another interesting point, because this celebration in particular, in the year 2008, was recognized as a, let's say, form of, as part of the local heritage. So it was turned into what we call in Spain, bien de interés cultural. This is a good of cultural interest. So it means that it has a special legal protection. And bien de interés cultural involves not only material goods, but likewise, let's say, intangible goods, as in this case, the celebration of the banner in the city of Majorca. Well, this is another striking, perhaps a little bit striking, because traditionally the notion of Reconquista has been connected to Spanish nationalism. So actually it is the product of Spanish nationalism. And in this regard, I said before that it is actually the hallmark of traditional Spanish scholarship. But in this particular case, we find sectors of Catalan nationalism that draw on the notion of Reconquista as the origins of the nation. Like in the case of this group called Som Catalans, we are Catalans, where they say that the Catalan countries, what they call the Catalan countries, the Països Catalans, is a nation born out of the fight against Islam. Whereas this is literally a very similar principle or notion, sorry, in Spanish scholarship, which considers that Spain is a nation shaped against Islam. This is a very common idea, for example, in 19th century Spanish scholarship, well, 19th century and even 20th century, and even 21st century in some cases. So in this case, we find this same idea in the case of Catalan nationalism, which is a bit striking because Spanish nationalism and Catalan nationalism are supposed to be totally opposite. Well, the main difference is that while this idea, I think it's merely a fringe approach in the case of the Catalan nationalism, it is not in the case of Spanish nationalism, where it is much more mainstream, let's say. So that's, I think, the most important difference of this re-engineering of the notion of Reconquista in the case of Spanish nationalism and the Catalan nationalism. Well, over the last years in Spain, we have seen how this narrative of the Reconquista gained traction among different sectors, especially in the most conservative sectors of Spanish society, and very closely associated, as I said before, with Spanish nationalism. So I'm turning now to the case of Murcia, which, as I said, was taken by King, was first taken by King Ferdinand III in 1243, but then it was completely seized by King Alfonso in 1262. So last year, actually, this political organization, Vox, called Vox, claimed the Day of Murcia to be celebrated in February 2, which is precisely the day of the taking of Murcia by King Alfonso. So they wanted to shift the Day of Murcia from the day which is celebrated currently, which is, I think, in June, to February 2. So making it coincide with the medieval conquest of Murcia. Well, this is not by any chance an isolated case, because we find something very similar, for example, in Andalusia. I'm bringing here this tweet by a Spanish politician, Santiago Abascal, which is the leader, actually he's the leader of this political organization, in which he is challenging the role of Blas Infante as the founder of Andalusia. Okay, Blas Infante is the founder of Andalusian nationalism. in the early 20th century. So the most interesting peculiarity of Andalusian nationalism is the fact that it draws on the Islamic period as the origin of the nation, while on the contrary, Spanish nationalism draws on Reconquista very much, relies on Reconquista as the origin of the nation. So Blas Infante was killed in 1936 in Seville, precisely, upon the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War by the Francoist forces. So he's a victim of the coup d'etat of Franco and of the Spanish Civil War. Well, in this tweet, Abascal, as I said, challenged the role of Blas Infante, who was recognized institutionally in Andalusia as the father of the Andalusian homeland. I think this is the expression which is used in the current constitution of Andalusia. Okay, local regulation. He was recognized as such by the Andalusian parliament early in the modern democratic period. So here he is challenging this role of Blas Infante as the founder of, or the father of Andalusia, as he was, as I said, he was recognized as the father of Andalusia. And he said that Andalusia's father is not Blas Infante, but King Alfonso VIII, the victor of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, King Ferdinand III, who took Seville in 1248, and Queen Isabella, who together with his husband Ferdinand of Aragon took Granada in 1492. So obviously he's relying on the notion, the narrative of the Reconquista as the origins of Andalusia, and not in Blas Infante as the founder of Andalusian nationalism. Okay, by the same token, a couple of years ago, this political organization claimed the Day of Andalusia again to be celebrated on January 2 instead of February 28th, which is currently the Day of Andalusia. And they claim to be celebrated on January 2, obviously because this is the date of the taking of Granada by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. So this is the end of the Reconquista, all right? Which the taking of the last Islamic stronghold in Iberia. So that gives us, I think, a clear vision of how this they're trying to bring this narrative of the Reconquista to the institutions, to the public institutions, so that this narrative becomes sort of official narrative of the history of Spain and its different territories. Well, I'm focusing now in Seville, which is very special, obviously, for me, for obvious reasons that I mentioned before. And Seville is a special case, as I said, because back then, I mean, in 1248, when it was taken by King Ferdinand, it was by far the most important Iberian city. It was actually the capital city of the Almohads ever since they came to Iberia. So on the slide, we may see Seville's cathedral over here. And I'd like to draw your attention here to this, what is actually the minaret of the old mosque, the old Almohad mosque. And here, this was likewise the courtyard, patio of the old Almohad mosque. The Almohads carried out a very significant urban reform in Seville in order to turn it their capital city in Al-Andalus. And this mosque obviously was a major feature of their urban reform. So I'm bringing this text from a 13th century Arabic author, which is Al-Shakundi, who said in his epistle in praise of Al-Andalus that he wrote early in the 13th century, he said, I put Ishbilia, or rather God put it, as the mother of all its cities, the center of its glory and its greatness, because it is its major town or city, maybe population is not very right here, and its largest city. So obviously for the people, for the Muslims of the 13th century, Seville, Ishbilia was the main center of the Muslim power in Iberia. And that, I think, explains very much what a great success King Ferdinand achieved in taking Seville. And this likewise explains why it took him more than 1.5 years to take the city. And indeed, I think that explains why he chose to be buried in Seville. Actually, he was buried in the Almohad mosque, which was not anymore a mosque, obviously, ever since 1248. It was turned into a Christian Catholic church. But the building of the mosque remained largely untouched until the early 15th century. So he was buried in a building that was previously an Almohad mosque. And this is the 4 languages inscription in his burial place or his tomb, his grave, which includes the same text, almost, in 4 different languages, in Castilian, in Latin, and as we see here on the slide, in Hebrew and in Arabic. So this is a unique feature, I think, of King Ferdinand that we may not find in any other medieval European king. Although I have to say that I think this passed rather unnoticed in many of the scholarship about medieval Iberia and King Ferdinand more specifically. Elena, 4? Oh my God. All right, so in Seville, there are 2 main ceremonies, commemorations, dealing with King Ferdinand. Every May 30th, the body of King Ferdinand, which is still buried in Seville's cathedral, is publicly showcased in the cathedral, so the people of Seville can pay him tribute, because he died, obviously, on May the 30th. So his mummy is preserved well, in a reasonable, good condition, and it is showcased every year to the people of Seville. Then there is a second commemoration in Seville, which takes place every November 23rd, which is the date of the taking of Seville. And this commemoration takes place within Seville's cathedral and involves the participation of the officials of the city, the mayor of the city in this case here, who is holding Saint Ferdinand's sword called Lobera, right? So this is a, let's say, mixed Catholic public commemoration, while the other one is more exactly a religious celebration, right? But this is a mixed up of religious, Catholic, and public celebration. Okay, over the last years, we have, let's say, a third form of commemoration in Seville, which is, we may say, some sort of popular celebration promoted by a so-called cultural association, Ferdinand III, which includes parading for the streets of the city and paying tribute to King Ferdinand. This is the monument that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, including this banner, which reads Ferdinand III, Patron and Liberator. Again, the same as in the case of Valencia, as I mentioned before. Well, I'd like to draw your attention to these people holding torches here, which perhaps reminds of, I don't know, it's a bit unsettling, maybe, I don't know. But, well, this is, as I said, something newer. This is something popular. This is not an institutional commemoration. Okay, now to wind up this lecture or this talk, I'd like to focus a little bit on scholarship, because as I said, obviously Reconquista played a very influential role in Spanish scholarship. This is the case of Claudio Sánchez Albornoz, which in all likelihood is the most, one of the best representatives of traditional Spanish scholarship, and to be sure, the most vocal representative of the notion of Reconquista, which he across his long academic path, he always supported as something really valuable and relevant for Spanish history. Okay, but Reconquista has been the hallmark of Spanish scholarship. Nowadays, it would be probably, well, it is not mainstream in present day Spanish scholarship, but it would be rather mistaken perhaps to brand it as a fringe approach. So it's still influential in many sectors of Spanish scholarship. So I'm bringing here one example from Professor Manuel González Jiménez, who was my doctoral advisor actually at the University of Seville. In this book, released in 1994, in which he advanced the idea that Andalusia is basically the product of modern Andalusia, I mean, is the product of 13th century Christian conquests or Catholic conquests. So that this process allowed the territory of Andalusia to get into the realm of the European culture. That's the expression that he uses. So Manuel González Jiménez obviously is a historian from another generation, later generation that than Sánchez Albornoz, right? Then I have a third example here. In this case, this is an op-ed by another professor of the University of Seville, Manuel Garcia Fernandez, not Fernandez Garcia, they put it wrongly. So this is an op-ed published in a local newspaper, online newspaper, a year ago, where he emphasized basically the same idea. When he claimed that Ferdinand III was the king who brought the cities of Córdoba, Jaén, and Seville back to the Christian, Western, and European civilization. So, what I'm wondering here, and I'm going to finish with this last thought, is to what extent this notion of Europe is a valid notion. I mean, to what extent this narrative is fueling, whether directly or indirectly, the idea that Europe is an exclusively white and Christian continent. So to what extent the cities of Córdoba, Jaén, and Seville were not part of Europe. Why? Because they were Arab and Islamic? Well, I find this notion a bit, as I said, a bit unsettling and perhaps even disturbing and baffling. But I think this is something maybe open to discussion. Thank you very much.
Fascinating, you know, the history, the historiography, the popular memory of these things. And there's so much for us to discuss now, and we have plenty of time to do so. So I open the floor to questions, or the internet to questions.
Yeah, question is around the body of it's, so it is adored as a worship, as a relic, or there is a
he's a saint. He's a saint.
So is there any, or have been in the past, worship as a relic, but without thaumaturgic or
okay. Not a specialist on this issue, but yes, he was considered a saint over the medieval period, and somehow his son Alfonso promoted this cult of Ferdinand as a thaumaturgical figure.
Well, not really thaumaturgical, I think. I know that in 17th, 18th century, it's true that after the display of Ferdinand, there were a lot of people kissing him. Well, you're going to be healed if you kiss the corpse. Not a great idea, especially it's maybe on Sunday. But really, I just think that really I think considering him a saint, was enough to claim.
He was declared a saint in the 7th century, in the 17th century, sorry, by 1671, I think.
So it was after 17th century when this.
He was officially declared a saint, but before he was considered a.
Yes, but in the sense of the Reconquista and gets canonized itself.
Yeah.
Once you've got Habsburg.
And yeah, the other question related to this is, has been this 30th of May reclaimed or taken by modern political parties
Yeah, sure.
as something?
Yeah, because nowadays, This is a tricky question. In Seville, we have the feria, feria is a popular celebration where people dance and drink, basically. So traditionally, May the 30th was a holiday in Seville. But a few years ago, they took this day and put it in the feria. They changed it, the holiday, took it from the day of Ferdinand and brought it to the feria. So they can have one more day free to go to dancing and drinking. So that created a bit of controversy because these groups are saying that you're not paying tribute to King Ferdinand by taking out his celebration as a holiday, as a local holiday in Seville. Yeah.
That was fascinating. It set me thinking about all sorts of things because you're talking about Reconquista as something in a very modern context. And I was wondering just how appreciations have changed over time, because my memory of the old royal titles to Alfonso XIII is that, in a sense, the kings saw themselves as heirs to the Muslim rulers, that Spain itself didn't exist, that he was king of Seville, king of Murcia, king of Granada, separately in the title. So although we say Castile and Aragon, those were still the very small regional kingdoms. And you got that appropriation, acquisition, whatever you want to call it, of Islamic culture maintained in Seville. Pedro I, as I was saying yesterday, and the way the Alhambra is simply taken over initially by Ferdinand. Again, it's Charles I, Charles V, who plonks his carbuncle in the middle of Cordoba Cathedral. It's he who plonks his own palace in the middle of the Alhambra. So you've got a sort of transition coming there. I just wonder whether there is a real break in appreciations of where the Reconquista fits in. And your comment about Catalonia struck me, because that sense of separation, that sense of difference, the war against Islam there is not reconquest, it's holding back. The common Catalonia is the frontier. I wonder what happens in Galicia, because that's where it all starts.
Well, starting from with the last question, I think the difference is that in Galicia there were no Muslims at all. In Catalonia there were Muslims. Even in Barcelona and in Girona there were Muslims. So that makes a great difference, I think, in Iberia, between the lands where they had Muslims and the lands where they weren't Muslims at all, which is the case of the Basque Country, not the case of Navarre, but the case of the Basque Country.
But some of the Catalan counties.
Yes, yes, but I think there is a big difference here. The way in which the presence of Muslims influences the modern nationalist thinking in Spain, particularly. That makes a big difference between the cases where there were Muslims and the cases where they weren't Muslims at all. And then, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the idea that the 13th century conquests were a tipping point in the history of Iberia. I think there's no doubt about it. But the thing is how we think of this process. It is indeed a far-reaching consequences process, but that is one thing. So to say that this is a tipping point is one thing. And another thing is saying these conquests brought this territory to the European civilization. I think these are two different things, because it doesn't have the same implications. It doesn't have the same implications. So I think there is a clear historical break when the Christians took over, because they completely changed many things. Not everything, of course, but many things. But when you put this historical process in a highly ideological context, you reach conclusions that are perhaps difficult to deal with, I think, because basically of ideological reasons. So it was a tipping point, absolutely, yes, I agree. But how we describe this this historical moment, how we consider the consequences of this historical moment, that's a different issue. And here I think the traditional notion of Reconquista has provoked many misrepresentations of the past, to my mind. And yes, I agree. For example, in the case of, for example, the Mosque of Cordoba, it is clear that King Ferdinand, when he took the city, he wanted to preserve the mosque. It is the best preserved mosque in Spain, by far. And it was the most important mosque in Iberia, because it was the Umayyad mosque. So why did Fernando decide to preserve the Mosque of Cordoba? Obviously because it was an Umayyad icon. It was the most important icon of the Umayyad power in Iberia. And the Umayyads were the most powerful rulers in Iberia over the medieval period, by far. In a short period of time, but they were the most powerful because they ruled 2/3 of Iberia, roughly. So obviously King Ferdinand decided to preserve that mosque because it was the sign of his victory over this terrible rival, which were the Muslims. So this is this sense of appropriation of now this is mine. It's no longer yours, and now it's mine. So yes, but around the mosque there are obviously many other issues that
we have time for another question, and I think Damian wants to intervene. Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was listening carefully to this and fascinated by the presentation, and of course some of the images that you have shown us are more than a little unsettling. But what I wish to ask really was that because people are using these notions for their political ends, does that mean that we should not use them as historians if we really feel that they do help us in understanding what was going on in the mind of Ferdinand III or James I or the clerics or the nobles, if they themselves had some sense of undertaking a restoration, a restitution, if not perhaps using the word reconquest, in wishing to understand what was going on inside their heads. Is there still not a validity to the use? And Dr. Perkis will know certainly better than I know I have great difficulty disentangling notions of crusade and and chivalry and reconquest here, but it seems still useful to have them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's a very nice question. There is debate currently in Spain about this issue. Basically, I think there are three groups among scholars. The ones who remain unflinchingly clung to the traditional notion of Reconquista. So Reconquista as a 8th century liberation struggle. These are the more traditional groups, minority groups nowadays. There is a second group which considers that Reconquista is still a valid scholarly notion, but once stripped away of its ideological burden, if possible. Then there is a third group which rejects openly the notion of Reconquista because they think it's impossible to get the notion stripped away of all its ideological burden.
What does that mean? I mean, they reject the notion of Reconquista, meaning, to come back to what Damien asked, does that mean those scholars that reject the notion of Reconquista reject the idea that clerics, warriors, kings were animated by ideas of liberation?
No, not at all, not at all. Within the, let's say, the middle group, so those who admit the notion but reject the ideological burden, they think Reconquista is a valid notion because it reflects the values in the medieval period, I think. So they think the Reconquista should be used as equivalent of an ideology of territorial recovery in the medieval period, and that's it. Yeah. Not as a name for medieval Iberia as a whole. Okay, I'm for example trying to remember the book by Derek Lomax, The Reconquest, which is a book on medieval Iberia, and the notion of Reconquista here involves the whole medieval period in Iberia. So for those historians, Reconquista is just an ideology of territorial recovery that operates at different levels. No, there is no one single ideology of Reconquista. There are different ideologies of Reconquista. There is the pontifical ideology of Reconquista. There is the Castilian idea of Reconquista, which is much more neo-Gothic ideology. Then there is the Hispanic Reconquista, and there is, which is prevalent in the Crown of Aragon. And then there is the Carolingian Reconquista, because the Carolingians actually were the first in taking lands of the Muslims in Iberia. When they took Gerona in 785, when they took Barcelona in 801. So the Carolingians were the first in taking lands to the Muslims in Iberia before the Iberian kings. Okay, so there are different levels of this ideology of recovery. There's no one single Reconquista. There are Reconquistas in plural. So this is more or less the situation currently in Spanish scholarship about this matter.
You're looking at me, someone interrupt that.
Yes, sir. Just maybe it's an eighth question, but is there any contemporary use in the Middle East?
The word Reconquista is hardly used in the medieval period, but there are obviously other notions that express the notion of recovery, because this notion is clear, existed. This notion existed, obviously, in the medieval period. The notion of retaking something that was lost with the Muslim conquest of 711. But the thing is that the notion of Reconquista involves a nationalist element, which is an 8 centuries long liberation struggle in which Spain was shaped as a nation against Islam. Okay, this doesn't exist. This nationalist element doesn't exist in the medieval notion of Reconquista, obviously. This is the conflicting point. When you took the notion, the medieval notion of Reconquista, and bring it into a 19th century nationalist context.
I know everybody's keen to have their lunch. Oh, I can see I have a hand up there as well. Can I just want, I mean, I want to flip it to the modern end of things. I'm really just statues. The coincidence of the timing of the construction of the statues, or the erection of the statues they refer to as Confederate statues, which have been torn down across America. I guess my question is, to what extent has there been hostility towards the sorts of public monuments? Like you've talked about the ways in which they're celebrated and become sites of memory and Reconquista harnessing those ideas, but are there voices in the public sphere in Spain, the academic sphere, that seeks to dismantle the statues?
As far as I know, there is still no conflict in this issue in Spain. Although I remember, well, there has been some conflict, to be more precise, because, for example, one statue of Almanzor was taken out in Algeciras, where he was born, and another statue of Abderrahman III was likewise withdrawn a few years ago. But as far as I know, monuments of Christian kings so far had been, I think, in this regard, respected. I remember one case of some sort of attack to the monument of the Catholic monarchs in Granada. But that's the only thing that I heard of in this, with regard to this issue.
Okay, I think we'll take the question on Zoom from Jules, and then we'll have our lunch here. So, Jules Wicker.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation, and I'm sorry, I just want to wind back to close to the beginning of it, which was a wonderful map showing phases of expansion southwards. And there's clearly a considerable hiatus between 1292, which is the penultimate, the next slide on. So if we move forward a slide. Yeah, great. So 1292, which is our green band, 13th century. Clearly, we're very conscious of 1492 being a significant date. We're also conscious of the 1390s being a period of anti-Semitic activity. Is there a strong sense of the centuries passing being a key anniversary, a time for settling scores or completing unfinished business? And if so, does that add another dimension to the impulse in 1482 to take Granada?
Okay, first maybe I have to say that between 1292 and 1492, obviously there were some things in between. Okay, was there, for example, Algeciras and all the cities, perhaps smaller cities, being taken by Castilian kings. So yes, maybe there is a gap, but not such a big gap. I mean,
what I was thinking of was simply whether 1292 stands as a landmark date.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
actually, I mean, it's clear that the 1491 stands as a landmark date for anti-Semitism. It's revived in 1492. But I wondered whether in Reconquista terms, 1292 is something that people have in mind as you're coming up to the end of the 15th century, and this is the time to deal with it.
I don't know, really. That's a tough one.
But there's nothing you've come across from the late 15th century that kind of refers to sites that moment at the end of the 13th century as a model or an impetus for a further drive south?
I'm sorry, but cannot say very much about it.
Okay,
Really.
that's fine.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. Just no, that's lovely. Thank you very much for taking the time to think about that. I realise it was a bit off the track of the main discussion.
Thank you for the question, and thanks to everybody online. I think we'll bring the session to a close, and those of us in Edgbaston are going to go have some lunch, and those of you online, you can have your lunch, or maybe in your case, Damien, your breakfast. And we'll look forward to seeing you in an hour or so, just 50 minutes or so, for our final roundtable discussion. But before we part company for this session, you'll join me again in thanking Alejandro for such a wonderful